talked about Charles Darwin, some of the stuff that came from that. Slavery had a lot of this kind of stuff in it. We're talking the Nazis and eugenics programs, forced sterilization, one-child policy, all these things that happened all over the world in India and elsewhere. All those things were justified by some greater danger. And you can kill people wholesale, and that's across all kinds of religions, all kinds of periods of human history. We're talking about this is a human problem. When human beings are convinced that there is some grave danger that's going to wipe us all out if we don't do X, Y, or Z, then you can, if you are effective at making that argument, you can get people to do all kinds of horrible things that they would never otherwise do.
So much of Paul Ehrlich's rhetoric spilled over into the environmental realm. This turned into the zero population growth movement of the 70s and 80s. In these years, this was mostly just a public awareness campaign initiated by advocates of the cause. Because of the absolute horror of these periods of history that we already talked about, there hasn't really been a widespread popular movement behind a very specific population control effort over the past couple of decades. But there's still plenty of the people out there pushing this type of rhetoric. I think we have a good example of Jane Goodall, who you might also remember from grade school or junior high. She, studied chimpanzees and all of that, but she's also has some curious ideas about human populations. Let's go ahead and play that Goodall clip.
We cannot hide away from human population growth because, it underlies so many of the other problems. All these things we talk about wouldn't be a problem if there was the size of population that there was 500 years ago.
Yeah, so, well, first off, let's point out, especially for those audio-only listeners, that she is sitting on a World Economic Forum stage delivering that quote. So that's something that we shouldn't just breeze past. But, what was the population 500 years ago? Jim, didn't you look that up yesterday when we were talking about this? Do you recall off the top of your head?
I do. The population of the world 500 years ago was about 500 million.
That's right. Or about 6% of what it is today. So according to Jane Goodall, the ideal population of the world would require shedding 94% of the population. So I wonder who gets to decide who's the 1 in 20 that gets to survive. That's a pretty troubling thing. Or we have Bernie Sanders talking during that incredibly embarrassing CNN climate town hall in 2016, which I will never forget, agreeing with the need to educate people on the need to curb population growth. Or those stories of AOC talking about how women have to take climate into account when they're deciding on whether or not to have kids. Or the report that I always bring up whenever we talk about this topic, again, I will never forget it, by the academics at Georgetown University and Johns Hopkins University in 2016, titled Population Engineering and the Fight Against Climate Change. In this paper, our academic betters outlined a spectrum of coercion of potential public policies to curb population growth. On the one side of that spectrum, representing the least coercive method, we have healthcare access, which is just abortion. The second point on this, a little bit more coercive, is preference adjustment, which this is basically just propaganda, putting this idea that you're better off just having one or fewer kids on billboards and movies and music videos and classroom lesson plans, everything basically. Just try to adjust the preferences of people without the use of force. Or the more, a little bit more coercive idea of tax incentives to reduce children. If you have too many, more and more kids, you're just going to raise your taxes and all of that. And then the most coercive thing is government mandates, just like China and the one-child policy or some of the other things that I had mentioned so far during this podcast, which they are very clear that they do not condone. So they make sure to say that they don't condone those, but that just kind of means that they condone all the other ones. Or the climate emergency letter that grabbed a whole bunch of headlines just a couple of years ago, signed by 11,000 scientists that talked about a climate emergency that was coming, that labeled economic and population growth as, quote, important drivers of increases of CO2 emissions. In that same letter, it says that population still increasing by roughly 80 million people per year, or more than 200,000 people per day. The world population must be stabilized and ideally gradually reduced within a framework that ensures social integrity. So all of these ideas are still out there. They're still being pushed by these same types of academics out there and these thought leaders and these ruling elite types and these, Davos billionaires in the Swiss Alps. It just doesn't, you don't see it too much on your daily, TV news stream or anything like that. So, Justin, thoughts on this kind of modern day, population control ideas?
So I know I make this point a lot on the show, but I can't. I just don't see any any other way around it. If you believe, as so many of these people claim they believe, that we are all going to die from climate change and that the whole world is going to burst into flames, that life cannot be sustained, that in the end humanity will falter, then almost any potential solution to that seems logical. No matter how tyrannical it is or awful or bloodthirsty or creepy or whatever, it makes sense, because if the alternative is we all die, right? If it's the equivalent of the asteroid hitting the earth and we're all going to die, then anything other than that would be morally preferable to a lot of people. Like that, logically, you can understand the logic of that, right? And that's why that idea that we're all going to die from climate change is so important to debate over, to push back against, etc. Because if you don't, then logically almost anything is justifiable. And we saw this play out with COVID, because that was exactly how they justified locking people in their homes, telling them that they didn't have free travel anymore, eliminating jobs by the millions, basically overnight. How did they just printing trillions of dollars that they didn't have? How did they justify that? They justified that by saying, well, lots of people are dying from COVID. So we can do all these things that we normally agree would be bad, but we have to do them in order to stop that. Except what they're saying about climate change is worse than what happened with COVID. They're saying climate change is going to kill everybody. Nobody said COVID was going to kill everyone, even at their high, even when fear was at its height. They didn't say every single person was going to die. Life on Earth couldn't be sustained. That's what they're suggesting. When you say that climate change is an existential threat to humanity and to nature, what that means literally is we are all at risk of dying as a result of it. All of human civilization, all of life, or nearly all, is at risk. And so you can justify anything. And that is why these things are so incredibly dangerous, because once you get to the point in time, we've seen this play out a million times throughout history. We talked about a lot of these different groups of people earlier. We talked about Charles Darwin, some of the stuff that came from that. Slavery had a lot of this kind of stuff in it. We're talking the Nazis and eugenics programs, forced sterilization, one-child policy, all these things that happened all over the world in India and elsewhere. All those things were justified by some greater danger. And you can kill people wholesale. And that's across all kinds of religions, all kinds of periods of human history. We're talking about, this is a human problem. When human beings are convinced that there is some grave danger that's going to wipe us all out if we don't do X, Y, or Z, then you can, if you are effective at making that argument, you can get people to do all kinds of horrible things that they would never otherwise do.
Yeah, and another thing, I brought this up already, but it's just another example of this idea of each additional person that's being born is just another burden on society that's pushing us closer to this idea of mass starvation or ecological collapse. So it's another example of of people in the minds of these ruling elite types. Instead of being assets, they're liabilities.
Yeah,
they have to be taken care of.
And just one last thing, we talked about Planet of the Humans before, and we've talked about that movie by Michael Moore produced it. Jeff Gibbs is the director of that, a close ally. These guys are heroes of the left for a long time. Most of that movie is about how renewable energy actually, windmills and solar panels and burning wood and stuff like that is not actually going to stop the climate crisis. These guys believe in the climate crisis, but it's not going to do that. So, but they have to have a solution, right? Otherwise, we're all going to die. So what's the solution at the end of the movie? There needs to be fewer people. That's the solution to the movie. That's how they end it. Yeah. You see? So in a bizarre way, the as stupid as the windmills and solar panels argument is, I guess it's the one thing keeping the left from getting to the Michael Moore part, right? For now, at least.
Yeah, maybe we should back off the whole
maybe we should be in favor of it, because, oh my God, what the heck's going to happen if they realize that's not going to work?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Sterling Burnett's the head of our climate center, and he's in the chat today. Hello, Sterling. And it's nice to have you there. And he's enjoying, actually, good conversations with our other viewers. But he would be the first to tell you that, obviously, these solutions won't work. If we were, I think even John Kerry has admitted that if we just stopped, if you could, we can't do this. But if you could stop all human CO2 emissions other than breathing outward, although reducing the population reduces a lot of the exhaling of humans and CO2 in the atmosphere. But if you were to do all of that, it wouldn't change the climate. It wouldn't change the weather 100 years from now. It wouldn't change the weather 2 years from now, 2 minutes from now. It wouldn't make any difference at all. And so these people on the left, these progressives, these control freaks, they're in a cult. I talk about this all the time. I mean, if you talk about, Mao's, the society that Mao made in China, and you think about the struggle sessions and the Great Leap Forward and all this stuff, you're able to move an entire society forward like that through two major forces you need to have. Force, by killing everybody who doesn't obey, and indoctrination, and basically creating a cult. Nazi Germany, cult. In modern environmentalism, it's a cult. These people are impervious to reason, and they're also impervious to appeals to compassion. Like, you can't do this. This is not just taking away my freedom. This is killing people, because they have it in their heads. They are actually mentally ill. Let's just say it. They actually think that humans are going to destroy the earth, that we are going to kill all of us by our consumption. But going back again, Donnie, to the Paul Ehrlich book, he's been wrong about every prediction his entire life. What is he now, in his 90s? And he was just interviewed on 60 Minutes, 6 months, 8 months ago, because he has yet another book full of BS. We're always going to be wrong predictions. But he had predicted, when the book came out, you said 1968. He was saying, by 1980, we were going to have 1 billion people starve to death. I don't know. I can pull numbers out of the air because they didn't mean anything to him. They shouldn't mean anything to anybody else. But mass starvation in just a few years. A new ice age is coming. We don't have enough food to feed everybody. What all of these cultists and these pessimists don't get is that human ingenuity figures out a way to make it happen. With the technology of the 1960s, you couldn't imagine feeding 8 billion people. Mm-hmm. With the technology of 2023, we can actually feed 10 billion people easily. This planet can support probably 10 billion people, maybe even more. But that's not what the left wants, because if you allow people to just be free and reproduce and populate and innovate and make life better, because life and actually the environment has never been better in modern society. But people don't believe it because the cultists are in control and they are doing all of the messaging, and people are actually, normal people that should know better are actually convinced of all this garbage.
Yeah, so that brings us up to today, but there's actually a new chapter that's starting to be written right now, and this comes from our friends over at the World Economic Forum. So as discussed in the Dark Future book, the Davos elite are expecting a disruptive wave of new technologies that's going to change everything about how our societies operate. So Yuval Harari is a futurist guy. He's a historian. He's a World Economic Forum advisor. But he's really the intellectual guru of the Davos elite. His worldview essentially underpins everything about the World Economic Forum and their positions on a whole host of different things. So we have a clip of Yuval Harari talking about how humans may be supplanted by robots and AI. And once that happens, what do we do with them? So go ahead and play that Yuval clip.
Now we see the creation of a new massive class of useless people. As computers become better and better in more and more fields, there is a distinct possibility that computers will outperform us in most tasks and will make humans redundant. And then the big political and economic question of the 21st century will be, what do we need humans for? Or at least, what do we need so many humans for?
Do you have an answer in the book?
At present, the best guess we have is keep them happy with drugs and computer games. But this doesn't sound like a very appealing future.
So yeah, again, it's you know what, like humans in his mind, once robots and AI are able to outperform all of us, what is the point of having humans? Like they're squarely, if this all comes to fruition, they are squarely in the camp again of being liabilities. You can't possibly be an asset to society if robots and algorithms can do everything better than you can. So what are people going to do? If we don't have jobs for them, keep them busy or anything, what are they going to do? His solution to that, or what he throws out there as like the only thing that they can think of at the moment, is I mean, this is just so absurd. You'd think I'd be making it up. That's why we had to play the clip, is to keep them happy with drugs and computer games. And when he means computer games, he means jacking you into the metaverse, right? So that you can live your life over there, probably reduces your carbon footprint and all of that. So you're not driving around and you know, consuming things outside of virtual reality. But that's the future now. So now we're going to have to, you know, we talked about like the Soviet Unions and like, you know, justify your existence. It's like, well, now we're just going to be having to justify our existence to Yuval Harari and the technological elite and the Davos elite over there at the World Economic Forum. This is absolutely bizarre stuff. But I think that this is like the, you know, we talked about that pivot point of people being assets and turning into liabilities. This is the extreme end of that, where you couldn't possibly be an asset to society. So what are these people going to do with you? As of now, we'll just keep them happy with drugs and computer games. Really, really, really sick stuff we've been talking about on this entire podcast, but this might take the cake. So Justin, thoughts on good old Yuval Harari?
Yeah, a lot of this, I think, stems ultimately from, one of the things I've been reading this book called God of Liberty. The book is by a historian. I think his name is Thomas Kidd, and it's about sort of religious views in the era of the founding of America. And it talks about the wide swath of views that existed amongst the founding fathers and people of that time. There were everything from, you know, your basic deist who really rejects basically all organized religion, but still believes in the concept of God, all the way up to like your devout evangelical Christian type, right? And Jews and some other people who are living in America at that time, right? But one thing that they all had in common, and this is embedded in our founding documents, and it's in the Declaration of Independence and elsewhere, is this idea that your rights, you have rights inherently, that you are born with rights, and that those rights exist, and that government should exist to protect those rights, but they don't have the power, the moral power. I mean, they can kill you and do things to you, but morally, they don't have the ability to take those rights away. That's what inalienable rights means. It means untransferable. You cannot destroy them. You can infringe them, but you can't get rid of them. They exist inherently just by being born into the world. But if you reject all of those concepts, if you reject all of that, and you don't believe even in a natural sort of rights, you don't believe that even if you reject the concept of God, you just believe you have rights because you were born into the world free and therefore you should have rights for that reason. If you reject all those concepts, which basically everybody, almost all of the elites today do for the most part, reject every version of this. They're not really deists that believe in, you know, sort of an objective moral standard, an objective morality, and objective rights. They don't even believe in natural law. They certainly aren't evangelical Christians in many cases, or devout Jews, or even devout Muslims, or any of those. Like, they reject the concept that rights come from something other than the government. And because because of that, anything goes. Anything goes. Yep. Nothing's off limits. And that fundamentally, our country was based on the idea that people wouldn't believe that. And yet now most people reject that concept, and all the people in charge reject, or most of them reject that concept. And that fundamentally is if we can't fix that part of the problem of just at least accepting that rights come from nature, that you're born free, at least that, if we can't even get to that point, there's no saving this country, because everything else falls down from there.
Yeah, I'm afraid that Yuval Harari is going to end up being the Paul Ehrlich of the next couple of decades.
Charles Darwin.
Right.
Charles Darwin. He's the next Charles Darwin, and a lot of what he says makes sense in a certain way. But if you accept the underlying premise, right? But that's the problem. And we can't survive as a country like that, not as a free country.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen, I'll give Yuval Harari a little bit of credit here, that he talks about a whole bunch of different stuff, whether it's this idea that we just talked about. He talks about the potential for this thing called digital dictatorships, which you could read about if you check out that book, Dark Future. But he always talks about these things almost as if they're like warnings or something, that he's not necessarily advocating for a digital dictatorship or anything like that. But he's just kind of giving a warning about it. But it's just like, you could see that even with like the Charles Darwin stuff that I read, where it's just like, they're putting this stuff out there as warnings. And then it's these future academics and all of that a little bit down the line that have that thought in their head. Like that's what's gearing their whole worldview, and then they do horrible stuff with it. And I'm just wondering what types of terrible stuff they're going to do with this Yuval Harari mindset in the coming several years. But well, Jim, let's take us home.
Well, I'll try to be brief. I mean, if you use the words useless and people in that order, you are not the good guy. And that's not something that actually talk about in the beginning of this, that people were applauding. When Kamala Harris said that we need to reduce population, either they heard her correctly and applauded for that, or they weren't listening. People laughed. People thought that was funny, using the words useless people.
Right.
You're not the good guy. You are perpetuating evil. I would have more respect for Yuval Harari, and we will have to look for this. But if you want to talk about warnings about what will happen in the future when artificial intelligence and technology and computer power makes a lot of what humans currently do obsolete, to what will become of humanity at that point? When you start using the words like useless people, and you don't also say, but people have value, right? Again, this is this mindset, and Justin had gotten to it, that they think that these powerful elites at the WEF, they really do believe that unless you are useful to their controlled socialist society in a way that they deem useful, you are not a person that needs to be in society anymore. So they'll just drug you up or plug you into computer games and keep you out of the way for the progress that they have planned. That is, frankly, evil. That mindset has led to the slaughter of hundreds of millions of people in just the 20th century. And it seems to be taking root again in the elite halls of power in the 21st century.